Hello and welcome to the Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today it's time for another edition of First Volume as we take a look at The All-Nighter, a Comixology exclusive. Cue those violins! It's been a couple years since I've done a video for First Volume, so just as a refresher, this is a bit different style of video where I take a look at a bit more of the creators and the presentation of the comic as opposed to the more summary and review focused series breakdowns that are most of my channel. The All-Nighter is written by Chip Zdarsky, who burst onto the comic scene in 2013 with the comic Sex Criminals, where he was actually the artist and Matt Fraction was the writer. That comic was about people who could stop time by having orgasms and decided to use that immense power to do things like rob banks. So, aptly named comic. If that's not really your thing, he also worked for Marvel for several years, writing comics like Daredevil and Spider-Man, including the very well-received Spider-Man Life Story, which reimagined the entire history of Spider-Man comics as happening in real time, somewhat similar to what Red Sun did for Superman. All-Nighter was drawn by Jason Liu, who, as far as I can tell, hasn't really done a whole lot so far yet, but has done some X-Men related work for Marvel and is perhaps best known for his own series, The Pitiful Human Lizard, a project he successfully kickstarted back in 2014. The colors were done by Paris Allain, whose name I probably mispronounced, sorry, who similarly doesn't seem to have done a whole lot yet, but I think we'll be seeing a lot more of him in the future. He's done some work for IDW, and was featured along with a host of other great artists in the kickstarted book Black Comics Returns. He's also won an Eisner for his coloring work in another Comixology original, Afterlift, which just so happens to be made by the same creative team as The All-Nighter. In case you're unfamiliar with Comixology, it was an amazing site where you could get digital editions of all your favorite comics, and then it was bought by Amazon. That's either a good or a bad thing, depending on your perspective. I'll leave my own opinion out of this for now. But that does mean that, as with all their other services, like Audible and Prime Video, there would soon be original comics available only through Comixology. Thus, Comixology Originals. You get it. These would feature comics from all kinds of big-name comic book creators, like Scott Snyder, and Scott Snyder. Okay, I kid, there's all kinds of creators on the platform, it just seems like whenever I hear about one of them, it's from Scott Snyder. He does have a few, so there's that. Anyway, one of Comixology's originals is, of course, The All-Nighter, which is supposed to be the focus of today's video, so maybe I should get to talking about that. What do you think? The comic focuses on an all-night diner called The All-Nighter Diner, so yes, it's the name of the comic. The All-Nighter Diner is manned by our four main characters. First up is the busser, Joy, a young girl the others claim has xeroderma pigmentosum, a real-world genetic disorder that creates a hypersensitivity to sunlight. Of course, that's not actually true, but we'll get to that. There's also Alex, who appears to be in his late teens or early adulthood, is a line cook at the restaurant, and he's super into superheroes. My kind of people. Next is Cynthia, the waitress, who apparently used to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. So a little weird that she's waitressing in an all-night diner now. There's also the mysterious owner and head cook of the All-Nighter, Ian, who we don't learn a whole lot about, at least not until the very end. He seems to be a bit of a leader of their little four-person group, but also kind of not really, as there doesn't exactly seem to be an actual leader of their group. Ian just has a bit of a haggard, seen-it-all-before attitude that gives him an air of authority over the others. All four of them are pretty discontent with their current life, as is shown by them fighting amongst themselves and snapping at customers for saying espresso instead of espresso. I mean, I get it, there's no X in espresso. That bothers me too. But guys, come on, it's really not worth it getting worked up over how people pronounce things. It probably mostly comes from the mixtures of accents that person has undoubtedly been exposed to in their life. And you've probably picked up your criticisms from other people, and those criticisms probably came from somewhere racist. There isn't really a right or wrong in how you pronounce things. Except for espresso. That is wrong, don't do that. It's Alex who is the first to decide to do something about their boredom and discontentment. Initially, that's with some prompting from Joy, and the two decide to skip out on a night of work to go catch a superhero movie, even though Joy thinks superheroes are super lame. I think you're super lame. Sorry, Joy, I didn't mean that. Alex also doesn't care much for her Scorsese-style criticisms and runs off to be alone for a bit. When he comes across some people being mugged, he takes some inspiration from the movie he just watched, puts on a mask using some nearby laundry, and goes in to save the poor people. And I suppose I should mention that it's been revealed by this point that our four main characters are, in fact, vampires. That was never really a secret. It's part of the marketing of the series. Seriously, on page 3, they're shown drinking what can only be blood. In the first panel of page 4, Alex says, "We're vampires." So, yeah, not a secret. Which, I'll admit, I forgot happened and I guess didn't notice the first time I read this series and was kind of thinking we sort of had to figure this out on our own. So, whoops. So being a vampire gives Alex a real-life equivalent to superpowers, and when he basically gets away with his first night out on it, he decides to keep it up. But with great power does not necessarily come great skill, and when he attempts to stop an arms deal, he ends up finding himself in over his head. But luckily for him, Joy, who has figured out by now what's going on, decides to help him out and shows up in her own adorable little superhero outfit to save his life. There's a big point made here about killing a guy because he figures out they're vampires, because if he had lived, then a group called the Takers would have come for them. Another thing I didn't get the first time I read this was that this was supposed to be some kind of societal rule for vampires, that vampire law is basically that regular human beings are simply not allowed to know that vampires exist, no exceptions. And if they do learn, then they have to be killed. What I thought was going on, and maybe this is sort of an intentional misdirect, is that the Takers was a nickname for vampire hunters, and that if people learned that they existed, then they risked leaving a trail that would bring vampire hunters after them. Thankfully, the collected edition comes with Chip Zdarsky's original pitch for the comic, which clarified this fact for me. But wearing these costumes is a bit of a loophole in this, because while people aren't allowed to know that vampires exist, it's okay for them to think that superheroes exist. For some reason. I'm sure that makes some kind of sense. The activity of these two, though, inspires others to put on ridiculous costumes and go out, including creating a new group of supervillains that attack a bridge into town. But these aren't regular people being inspired, these are other monsters, and the bridge attack is done by some bridge trolls who are excited for the ability to get out now that they can vaguely hide their identity. And I do mean vaguely, because I don't really know who they think they're fooling in those costumes. Those guys are clearly not human. And this is basically how we learn that there are monsters other than just vampires out there. Although we did get a visit earlier from a guy claiming to be Frankenstein, and he had some rather unique troops. Although this was yet another thing I didn't quite catch on my first read through, and it's that these troops are actually supposed to be werewolves. I kinda just thought he had other vampires under his control. I mean, they don't say what these guys are, and they don't really show much beyond some vampire-looking teeth and a little bit of hair that's easy to overlook or explain away as an unkempt beard like Ian has, so, you know, why would I think they were werewolves? The trolls aren't the only ones inspired by Alex and his superhero Night Shock identity, and Joy's sidekick identity of Night Kick. Look, she was on the spot, okay? And side note, I really love watching Joy go from being all like, superheroes suck, to really enjoying playing the part of one. Anyway, this evil clown named Buttons also decides to get in on the fun, going full Joker on the city at the first opportunity. Because wouldn't it be a clown that embraced being a supervillain? Buttons is a boogeyman, and I both love and hate this character because, yeah, he's perfect, but also as a clown, he's terrifying. But honestly, he's still not as freaky looking as the boogeyman from real Ghostbusters, so I'm fine with it. The open attack on the city by Buttons and his minions gets Cynthia and even Ian to join in on the fun of vigilantism. I'm not going to spoil everything that happens here though, since this comic is still running, and if you're curious, you can read this first volume and start picking up the individual issues that will make up the second. The second volume volume, I'm going to guess we'll go more into the lore for the series, as this volume just cracks the tip of the iceberg on it. At one point, Frankenstein explains to us that rather than Mary Shelley's book being about him, as you might assume, he believes that he came into existence because of her book. And this may be the case for all supernatural entities. They're suggesting that human beings' cultural belief in monsters is what actually created the monsters. We also see a little bit of the Takers, enough to understand that they are the law and order of the world of the supernatural. And they'll certainly be a bigger part of the future of the series. Honestly though, that kind of worries me. I've seen with plenty of other series the mythology of the series taking over and removing us from what was actually interesting about the series. With this series, I very much feel like the why things are happening is much less interesting and important than the fact that they are happening. The Takers are essentially just the MacGuffin that gives us why Alex decides to be a superhero. Exploring them more is going to take away from the fun of a vampire dressing up as a superhero. Or at least it could. I'm also not really invested in any of the characters. They're all crabby and unhappy when we first meet them, and while that does make sense, it doesn't exactly endear us to any of them from the get-go. I'm also not super impressed with the art. Elaine's colors are probably the highlight of the series, I feel, but there's nothing here that's super impressing me or making me feel I need to see more. None of it is bad, but none of it is really that great either. So I'm giving my future interest in this series a medium. I would certainly be happy to read more of this series, but I'm definitely not chomping at the bit. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this comic, or if you're interested in seeing more of it, or if there's anything you'd like me to cover either as a first volume or a regular series breakdown. And if you enjoyed this video or just want to be a nice person, then please make sure to click the like and subscribe so you can be sure to be here next time, and I hope to see you then, right here, in the Comic Cave.